Architecture is not just here to give space and shelter for man, but architecture also has the purpose of marking and enhancing man's time on earth.
Mr. Hallaby, I remember when you were head of the FAA and came into the Dulles Airport picture about January of '61. But what I've never had a chance to ask you was, what was the experience like of working with an architect like Aero, so a very determined, creative man?
Well, it was stimulating and I thought inspiring. So many dull things about working in the government. Here was creation personified, imagination, vision, and a lot of guts, I thought. So it was one of the most interesting and delightful parts of the job.
Part of you had the job of selling the architecture, so to speak, yourself, presenting this whole concept of the mobile lounges to the airports, which was sort of acting like an architect. What was that role like?
Well, you know, you learn so much from an inspired person, particularly an inspired creative person, that you enjoyed becoming a salesman for him, or a campaigner, or a promoter. And the idea is so sound, so basically right, that it wasn't a chore, it was sort of an opportunity.
Would you explain really why you think the mobile lounge is such a sound concept?
Well, first, in terms of safety, it really doesn't make too much sense to bring a big, hot airplane into the garage or the terminal. The terminal ought to go out to the airplane, because it's much easier to service the airplane, safer to service the airplane, fire, and so on and so forth. The second reason it's so right is that we habitually underestimate the growth of air travel and air cargo, and it has great expansibility. All you have to do is add some mobile lounges and some more places out in the middle of the field, which is otherwise unutilized. The other way, which is quite upside down, is to keep bringing bigger airplanes into a smaller space, so to speak, and that doesn't make any sense. The third thing is, the whole concept of transportation is to get a person safely, swiftly, comfortably, economically from where he starts to where he ends. And very few people want to fly between airports. They want to go from stoop to stoop or door to door. And why should you have to park miles away, trudge, then get your ticket, then trudge some more to get in the airplane? You ought to be able to park, walk very quickly, comfortably, get right into something that will take you to the airplane. So, in terms of comfort, is another very great reason for having it. So, as you can see, I'm quite sold. Not all people in the airline industry are.
Isn't it also expensive to move these big planes in, the jet planes, to taxi them? It seemed to me Aero always used to make that point.
Yes. One of the costs of current airports, not a future airport like this one still is the taxiing time from the close-in terminal out to the takeoff point. And when the jets get larger, as they inevitably will, the cost of taxiing for supersonic transport, for example, would be hundreds of dollars per minute. So if you are nearly the takeoff point. When the passengers board and you start your engine, there's a great saving. The real saving is in the comfort and the convenience to the traveler, which is the purpose of an airport and an airline. Aero's determination was that this be a dignified, beautiful, functional place, all at once. Dignity, beauty, and utility. And the only way to keep it that way was to design the concessions in and not let them take over the design of the building. So we had to set up a design advisory committee, give them unusual advisory power, and see to it that the original concept was kept clean and proper. It'll be a continuing struggle because all sorts of people want you to make all sorts of exhibits, sell all sorts of stuff, display it in a tacky, inefficient way. And I hope that that determination that he had and that I felt will continue.
That also extended to the surroundings, to these buildings, these low-lying buildings we see around, the utility buildings, and the landscaping.
That's right. I feel the landscaping is terribly important around an airport. You shouldn't suddenly come out of a freeway or a highway into a kind of aeronautical slum. You ought to have this highly utilitarian facility look a part of the community.
Red, white, blue service to Los Angeles is now...
Elaine, is it true that Aero thought of the airport as one of his chief works?
Well, chief works, no, that wouldn't mean, but what did happen was that he came out and he saw this building in June of '61, and at that point it was under construction and there were just the columns and the cables reaching across, so that he saw it in a sort of skeletal way like this.
Yes, I see.
And then he came home, it was late at night, and he really was very excited, and he said, and I quote this, he said, "I think this is the best thing I've done. I think it may be really good, and maybe it will explain what I mean about architecture." And it's the only time, he was very self-critical, as you know, it was the only time that I ever heard him say, "I think this was maybe going to be really good." So it was chief in that sense,
yes.
Not necessarily the most important, but the one he cared, certainly.
Right. But actually, besides being able to get this expression from him about the building, you were in a position to watch him develop the ideas for the building, weren't you?
Oh, yes. That was part of the fun of being married to him, was sort of sitting in the back scenes of all this. And he had a lovely habit. Every night that he was home, anyway, he was away a great deal, but when he was home, and at sort of 11 o'clock, we'd get together and have a nightcap, and he had those yellow legal pads, and he talked with a pencil, whether it was a paper doily in a restaurant or the yellow pads at home, and he would explain what he'd been doing and thinking, and he was talking with the pencil. So there were many, many sketches, but what happened was that first, after the Mobile Lounge was accepted as a concept, then he knew he could make the terminal a single compact building.
Yes.
And then he began making what he called abstract ideal shapes. There were these sketches full of reverse staircases and pyramids, all sort of like fantastic architecture. And then those got refined down to what would work and be functional.
Yes.
And finally into this form with this, he wanted something in this sweeping way.
Well, of course, it's very exciting to hear about this particular moment in the creation of the airport, and particularly since it's by Eero Saarinen, who I think all of us think of as one of the people we can really be proud of as an American artist. He was a real poet, a real doer, a man of action, a man of culture, and I remember him as being wonderfully serious and witty at the same time. What do you think really challenged him most when the commission came in? Can you reconstruct the moment when you first heard him say that the airport was going to be done by his office?
Yes, it was sort of a three-part thing, Edgar. On the one hand, he was terribly excited to build something that was in the nation's capital. Not just, I mean, any architect, I think, would feel that, but I think the fact that he was a naturalized citizen, this was his new country, and that he was building something in our capital had very special meaning for him. And he was, you know, he's a very patriotic kind of man. When you say he was a serious man, he felt very strongly about these things. And the thought that he would be adding to the national image and having a chance to do a 20th century building in the capital, the gateway to the capital, both from people abroad and at home, that was one thing that was very exciting. Then there was the challenge of building an airport which could really face the future. Here, as he said, nobody, his own words were, nobody asked us to grapple with the problem of a jet-age airport. But he felt that was part of the artist's and the architect's responsibility. So the second great challenge was the chance to build a jet-age airport, one that was built for the future, and to really accept the total responsibility of that whole program.
Yes.
And then the third feeling was just how marvelous to be able to build an airport. He felt he was very lucky in all his commissions because he felt he was a man of our time and that he had been given commissions that had to do with our time, research centers and airports particularly. Right. So that he believed in the plane and he believed in travel, but he felt that it was just terrible what happened to the human being.
I imagine that when Eero first started to think about the airport, that all sorts of images of national capitals and gateways to them in the old world passed through his head. And of course, most of these are really based on old city walls, fortifications, in some cases on Roman triumphal arches, as in Paris. And only very few have the particular quality of this airport, which is really, in a sense, a colonnade, isn't it?
Yes, but part of this is it's a colonnade for several reasons. This was sort of to extend the image of the nation's capital, and Washington is basically a neoclassic and columnar city. Right. And Eero said, he said, I believe that federal buildings should be classic in spirit. It's when you take the style or a dilution of the style that you make a mistake, but that you can take the spirit, so that the columns represented a spirit. However, though that sort of column, it was the all over Washington, and that kind of architecture is static.
Yes. And
what he wanted to do in the airport was to make something dynamic, this feeling of passing through the gateway. So the great challenge and the thing that interested in him, and as he said, if we can put together this static feeling of the columns, plus the dynamic sense of a gateway and going through, we can have an interesting building.
Yes.
And the idea then of making the roof so that it would be something which was higher in the front and then lower in the middle and then a little bit high again in the back was to give you this dynamic sense of going through.
Yes,
so we're putting those together.
Aline, when you were talking about Eero's image of the classical building as a series of regularly repeated columns, and also this desire to change this image into one that really had a dynamic lift to it, made me think a little bit of those wonderful colonnades at Cranbrook where Eero grew up that his father had designed.
Yes, I think Cranbrook had a sort of subliminal influence on Eero. I don't think he ever articulated it very much, but he respected it and respected his father's work. And I remember when I first came out to Bloomfield Hills, he took me to Cranbrook and he showed me that colonnade, and he pointed out how particularly beautiful it was seeing the columns against the sky. And of course that's one of the things that's sort of marvelous here, I think, looking up and seeing the sky through these columns. So I think this was maybe a subliminal influence.
Right. But of course his father's work must have influenced him in other ways too.
Yes, and the whole massing of buildings and the whole fact that a building was a complex and the whole feeling that everything was related to everything else, you know, from the ashtray to the table to the room to the building to the city.
Right.
But particularly, I think, his father's railroad station in Helsinki, because that celebrated the excitement of travel and the excitement of the railroad. And as a little boy, he felt this. And partly this was a big influence, therefore, when he built an airport. He thought that an airport should have as much a ceremonial entrance as the railroad chain used to. And why in our time couldn't we make people feel the same excitement and wonder and the dignity of, you're a traveler, you're going someplace on this marvelous machine.
Surely. Well, really, Eero did have a marvelous family background. This ability to grow up as the son of a great architect and of a mother who, after all, was a very famous weaver. And when they both migrated, his father and mother, to this country from Finland, after all, Eero was, what, 12 or 13 years old? And then he grew up in this truly utopian school that they established outside of Detroit at Cranbrook, where the arts and the sciences probably had a surrounding unequaled anywhere in the world.
When he worked with his father, he worked within the form of his father. And then when he got out on his own, when actually the first thing when he did the St. Louis Arch,
right.
Which was on his own in a competition against his father, he really wanted to use the technology of our time, and he wanted to express the means of our time. And something like this airport could never have been done without the kind of structural possibilities and excitements and General Motors, all the development of new materials.
Yes.
This was all sort of the feeling that his father belonged to one world and one generation, and he belonged to another world and another generation, and that its possibilities were so fantastic.
Right. But it was just these possibilities of the new world that are terribly interesting here at Dulles. Here is this place planned for the future of air travel as much as the present, in every way ahead of every other airport in the world as far as human convenience goes. And I wonder how much did all of these purely technological and scientific and modern social problems affect the design of the building itself?
I think they were essential to it, and they were the beginning of it. Without the preliminary studies of how people travel, the use of an airport, the whole concept of bringing the passenger to the plane instead of the awkward thing of having to bring the plane to the passenger, all this was thought of, and months and months and months, I think almost 14 months, was spent on that kind of study before there was any thought of design.
Really?
And part of Aero's success, he always felt, was that he used to say, it's not that I'm better than other people, but I work harder. Well, he did work enormously hard. He was a totally dedicated man. And architecture, he said, was his first love, and it really was. But he also was terribly good at educating clients and at making them understand and bringing them along. And he felt that was part of the architect's responsibility. I felt very sad, of course, that he missed so many of the dedications of really his 10 very important buildings that were finished after he died, although he had designed them. And at the dedication of Dulles, it would have been a marvelous moment for him, because here was President Kennedy, who was then president, and President Eisenhower, who had been the president when the commission had come, and the Star-Spangled Banner, you know. But the funny thing was, I was sitting next to President Eisenhower, and he saw that I was sort of emotionally moved, obviously, by this, and he was sort of trying to be nice and making small talk with me. And he said in a very confiding way, he said, you know, I don't really like modern architecture. He said, I really like colonial architecture. And when I found out that we were going to build this modern airport, he said, I was sort of worried. And I said, well, I hardly think we could have had a colonial airport. And then very nicely, he said, no, and I think this one has worked. But his inclination was in that direction. President Kennedy was terribly excited about the building and asked question after question about the structure and how it was made, and felt that it was a challenge to him to make more good modern buildings in Washington.
Well, he certainly got a good one here.
Maker service to New York.
The marvelous feeling of soaring that Aero really achieved in this building must have been something that he worked very hard at.
Yes, you know, he talked about the fact that architecture was really a fight against gravity, and he said that if we don't watch out, if we don't work very hard at it, everything we do becomes too heavy and too downward pressing.
This really has to do with the fact that the materials themselves are heavy, doesn't it?
Yes, and that the force of any arch is downward.
Right.
But he worked at this very much. If you think back over his work, Edgar, it's absolutely, he wanted the arch to spring, and it does, but he said it was earthbound.
77, stop to Los Angeles, and I'll be boarded at gauge 8.
Yeah.
Then when he did the Milwaukee building with a cantilever, he was able to make it sort of stretch out.
Non-stop for Dallas is now ready for boarding at gauge 17. All aboard, please.
Right.
And then when he got to the hockey rink at Yale, this he felt was the big breakthrough, because there you have a wonderful kind of a business where the arch comes down and curves up again at the edge, so that it didn't go down into the ground.
Right.
And it was really the arch in the hockey rink that made this building at Dulles possible, and this roof, because he'd been worried that if you did a hanging roof, if you did this thing like this hammock between these columns, higher over there, and then down, and then a little bit up again, that it would be oppressive. but because the hockey rink was this sort of double-saddled
Yes.
thing, you had the hanging roof, and he found that it wasn't oppressive and that it did go up.
Right.
And one of the things that made him happiest was at the hockey rink, there was a goalie playing for Yale team
Yeah.
who said to him one day, I don't know anything about architecture, he said, but when I look at this building and I stand at the goal and I look up at that roof, it makes me feel go, go, go. And he felt that was sort of the, you know, it really did soar.
Sure.
Well, here, of course, you have, I think it really works, don't you?
I know it works. But it's such an extraordinary thing that architects can have this victory over brute matter. It's really like the great Gothic cathedrals in a way, isn't it?
That's right, where everything presses downward, and they did everything they could to make you feel it's reaching upward. Here, of course, it's a similar thing to that kind of, if you want to call it faking, but it's really dramatizing, because these columns, which lean outward to counteract the pull of the hammock-like cable between, they're really like trees, could have been just plain in shape.
Right.
But both their outward tilt and this compressive flange, this thing that balances them down at the bottom, was exaggerated to make it dramatic, to make you feel that they were reaching up, not pressing down. And then seeing the sky, of course, which I think is lovely. That's one of the prettiest things, don't you think?
Oh, it is very beautiful, but I think what you've told us about the manipulating of the engineering into an expressive shape is, in a sense, really what architecture is about, isn't it?
Yes.
It isn't just getting a structure up and making it work, it's also making it sing. And that's what the Gothic men were able to do, and it seems to me that's what Aero was able to do here.
It's what, also at TWA is another example of their counteracting barrel vaults. But by that time, he had learned how to do the same thing, so it seems to go up. Also, the business of soaring to Aero was a way, sort of making this idea of the dignity of man come through, of making you feel as if you wanted to take a deep breath, of standing taller, of being a human being.
In talking about the Gothic architects, it made me wonder about how many, many generations there were of people who worked in this one style in the Middle Ages. And when we were looking at the various things that Aero had done, it seemed to me one almost felt he had a different style for each building.
Well, in a way he did, because he felt very strongly. As a matter of fact, I think it came from Louis Sullivan, but very much this thought that each problem has its own solution.
Well, in that sense, he was doing what two of the most famous of all the predecessors in modern architecture that he had also done, both Wright and Le Corbusier, who over very long careers produced really many different expressions, unlike architects in the past.
He said, actually, that in this connection, he said, I place myself humbly next to Corbusier and against Mies van der Rohe, although I admire Mies's work. But I think he felt spiritually closer to the two whom you've said.
Right.
Although a lot of the discipline, and certainly in his early work, came from
Mies. Yes, yes, it did. Well, the possibilities of exploring an architect's mind are really endless. But as a matter of fact, we're now approaching one of the most interesting portions of this building. And have you any idea of why all of a sudden at this end of the building and at the other, we see these struts, these braces that are placed up against the glass wall? That really seems out of place with the rest of the building in a way, doesn't it?
Well, I think they're there because they're necessary to begin with, and I think he felt that they did make a terminal. And this building, you know, it's like a sausage. It was built so that it would reach its capacity at this level in 1970, but then that it could expand. It's the only airport that isn't obsolete before it was built, and it's to be added on to. The other thing I think that was very important when you talked about the difference in Aero's buildings, he cared very much about the relation of the building to a site, so that it was not only the difference in the spirit of the building that motivated him, but also the possibilities of the site. And this site, for instance, was this beautiful, beautiful flat plain on which this building could be placed.
Yes.
And he said that architecture is really placing something between the earth and the sky.
True.
And he wanted to have the sense of this hovering roof, so that as you approach from Washington along the access road, you come along and suddenly from the distance you see this building. Now, all the front part of it, the different ramps for arriving and departing passengers and parking, all this was to make a base for this building, and then you would have these columns and this hovering roof, the roof that would look as if it would hover.
In the planning of the parking lots and this extensive planting that went on with them, Arrow must have, after all, had a very good idea of how he wanted his building surrounded, but he must have turned to outsiders to help him with this.
Well, he did. You know, Dan Kiley, who did this one, and Sasaki, who worked with him a lot, were terribly important as landscape architects. He felt architecture should manipulate you emotionally.
Of course.
That there was an emotional as well as a logical reason. And all of these surroundings that were part of that different experiences.
Right.
I'm so glad the airport's being used so much.
It is good.
I think it is romantic at airports. We hear all these places where you're going, Seoul, Anchorage, Dallas, whatnot. And that's what he tried to get in the architecture.
Well, he did. But you know, also, in thinking of the emotional content of architecture, part of the emotional content is to recognize the emotional impact of logic itself. That is, reason, if it's beautifully handled, is really an emotional pleasure.